My name is Paul Alexander, and I'm, I guess, a serial collaborator now with Spyderco, mostly on the design side. I'm not necessarily a custom maker or anything like that. And I've been, I don't know, collecting knives almost as long as I can remember. I was avid in the Boy Scouts as a kid, and my dad is a pretty active gun collector and shooter for competitions and things like that. So in Texas, I would always tag along to the gun shows. But guns weren't necessarily my thing, so I'd always gravitate towards the knife tables and things like that, to the point where I would save up my allowance and things like that and buy a special knife like a year later and things like that. And that sort of collecting has grown with me throughout, you know, my entire life. And then as I got a little bit older, I started paying more attention to like the Spyderco forums. I've always been a big fan of Spyderco knives. Bought a couple back in the day when it was just a stainless steel construction and things like that at those gun and knife shows as well. And then as I got more involved in that forum community, I eventually found like the contact information for who handles a lot of the IP and things like that for Spyderco. And just, I randomly sent him a design. We started interacting more because of some of the unique aspects of what I was trying to design at that stage. And then we sort of just had some back and forth, did some initial sketch sort of handoffs, and then I started getting more serious about it. That's where I started using the CAD tools to do the actual sort of finalized, you know, full design of the individual pieces. And then because I come from that engineering side of things, I'm a researcher for General Motors for my day job, but I still use a lot of the same sort of design tools and things like that we use in that industry. And I was able to create the designs and then use rapid prototyping technology to basically create small plastic models. And those models, I would build numbers of pieces up till I got all the ergonomics right and some of the lock designs and things like that working about as best as you can with plastic sort of components. And then I'd send those into Spyderco where they'd get refined and productionized. And then eventually I had one of my first models came out, I think in like the mid 2010s, like 2014, 2015 time frame. And then now I'm on my 5th collaboration. So I just keep submitting ideas, and then whenever they decide that something within the sort of catalog of designs that I've submitted to them is ripe for production, they'll take it, work with a supplier or one of the, sometimes, I don't have anything that's been made in America yet, but I've had Japanese collaborations, Tai-Chung collaborations, and then now also with the Italian manufacturers that they use as well. So starting to get a little bit of all over the place here. And so that's basically my process, is starting more from the design side of it, then prototyping using some of the tools that now everyday people can use, you know, 3D printers that in-home sort of house sort of thing. And then you can find the actual sort of componentry to build up the prototypes from some of the knife supply houses online. So you can actually use real pivots and things like that are meant for production. You know, everything to try and tailor my plastic models so they're as close to the real thing as possible. And I even have some designs from a few years ago that are flippers that I put ball bearings in the plastic designs, and you can still actually use those today. So a little bit different than some of the more hands-on sort of collaborators that Spyderco uses, but something that might be a little bit more accessible to the younger sort of designer out there, because those CAD tools now are very affordable and easy to get, especially since you're really only working with like 2.5D, you know, it's not really full 3-dimensional designs. So a lot of things like that you can get some open source software for. And then like I said, with 3D printing, you can do a lot of the refinement, you know, on your own before you submit something to Spyderco, and then it's something that you sort of ironed out a little bit of the early sort of design problems and issues, hopefully, and then that'll make it hopefully a more appealing sort of potential collaboration for Spyderco. So that's kind of how I've gone through. I'm still a collector at heart, I guess. I've got hundreds of Spyderco knives and even other knives and things like that. So still very active in that side of things, but yeah, still try and create pieces that have the Spyderco design language, but are a little bit different and out there, so that they're maybe more intriguing for a collaborative sort of project than something that's a slight variation on something they either have in production or have had in production as well. And when I sort of sat down with the NAND, I wanted to, well, a lot of my past work has been doing interesting and different things with the Spyderco proprietary locks. Like I made one of the first compression lock flippers with Spyderco that was out there. And with this one, I wanted to do something that was non-locking, but still had a different sort of take on the mechanism. And you see a lot of the double detent sort of locking on the modern sort of slip joints like this. With the design in the NAND and some of the other parts I did, I sort of worked on relocating it. So those detent arms are in different position than typically back here, rearward of the pivot. So the idea here is when you're grabbing it in this sort of position, not only are you mostly just holding the blade, so to speak, but you can also put additional pressure on those detent bars, and that makes locking even more, or unlocking more difficult if you're unintentional on it as well. Then for the aesthetics, I went for something that's much more linear in design, I would say, and very simplistic. So the whole construction of the knife is basically a couple slabs of titanium, and then the blade itself, and then very simple sort of washer sort of construction, so none of the bearings or anything like that, but still you can get a very nice sort of smooth motion out of it. And I would argue, sort of looking back at like my first design as well, you'll see some of the standard design cues. So I like a swell at the butt of the handle there to sort of fill out the palm, and then a forward choil. And you can kind of see this is the Ouroboros, my first collaboration with Spyderco. The same design language is still there, right? It's sort of more of a simplified sort of version of that, sort of using the linear sort of design. And then the other thing I was kind of going for as well is like, this is a plastic version. So I mentioned before how I use 3D printing to sort of refine some of my designs. I wanted the blade itself to kind of have an interesting and complete sort of blade shape, since I wasn't really necessarily needing to have any of the interfaces for the locking mechanism that usually go that. So I wanted something that if the blade itself, you could actually hold it in hand and it wouldn't be great. Granted, you only get maybe a finger and a half sort of purchase on it, but that same sort of thing sort of speaks through. So I try and sort of mimic the same lines in the blade sort of thing within the handle contours as well. And then the idea there is too, when I'm gripping it up here in the forward position, I really am gripping the blade surfaces that are just sort of reinforced by the handles. And so it gives you the intent is to give you as a firm and sort of confident a grip as possible, even though it's a simple sort of slip joint sort of design. And then like you were mentioning before, sort of hearkening back to some of the tails that you see on straight razor sort of designs too, that are also non-locking. That's the purpose of the extended tang. You can, with a little bit of practice, get to the point where you can flick it open sort of deal, but also the point there is to have that overlap when you are in that rearward grip, so you can keep your thumb on the top of it and sort of potentially keep it locked too. So the idea is a little bit of that straight razor design sort of element to it, but really trying to take a more simple sort of friction folder design and do a really modernized sort of take on it. So it's like a techno-primitive sort of style of design that I would talk to it. And then from there, once the design started to take shape, I started like adding the little details and things like that to keep it a little bit more minimalist in the design and everything as well. Originally, I didn't have a pocket clip on it because I was a little bit worried that the detent wouldn't be strong enough to keep it nicely closed. but with the construction, you know, like I said, the real all metal construction that goes into it, the detent strength is much stronger and has a much better retention on the blade. And then Spyderco, that was one of the great things. They figured out how to add a pocket clip to it. And then I'm a big fan of the wire pocket clip. I think I've used the wire pocket clip on all of my designs. And it's fun to see it here. And then actually the design language of the pocket clip actually blends well with all the other aesthetics of the design. So hopefully it creates something that's a little bit different than some of the other Spyderco products, and has some interesting aesthetics and little details like the tip of the blade allowing for this handle flat to rest flat against the table is something that was nice to see the manufacturers will sort of realize as well. And then again, like I said, keeping it down to a minimum of lines to make the overall handle shape and the knife shape as well. Along with that sort of techno-primitive idea and concept I was going with, when we eventually had to select a new and unique name for it, some of my initial ideas were already taken. So I started to think back as like, okay, if we're talking high tech, if you roll sort of the tape back on that all the way to the early days, I started thinking about early sort of computers and things like that. And that's where the name sort of came from. The NAND stands for like a negative and logic gate. And logic gates are basically the building blocks of all sorts of computing sort of things. And like you've got the and the or, and then you've got the negative and, which is the NAND, and the negative or, and some other sort of versions of that. And being that and or, the typical two logic gates, are a little bit too common of words to use, I decided to use the NAND, which is the negative version of that. And then it was kind of fun because the open and close thing sort of equates to the on-off and the binary nature of a logic gate, which also fed into the design as well. The simplicity of it, a lot of it is everything's a line or a circle sort of thing, so you get a little bit of that digital binary vibe sort of carried through in the design as well. So it was kind of fun trying to come up with that name. A lot of people won't get it, but some of the folks that are more in the computer and IT industry, which also has a large following in the knife community, if you look at Instagram and things like that, will kind of get the tie in there. So something definitely that is probably not a knife name that's ever been used before that I was going for, but also would feed back into sort of the design aesthetic as well. So sort of again that techno primitive, the early sort of logic gates that are the basis of all computer sort of programming and everything from there. So that was kind of a fun sort of creative exercise in coming up with a name that was new and different, but also sort of still spoke to the design aesthetic. The ball detent locking design of Bob Trezzola's was one of the precursors, I would say, to this type of locking or slip joint mechanism, non-locking mechanism. So I think that's the first time you see it, where basically is kind of a little bit of an ingenious sort of idea on his side, is to take the same sort of construction you see in liner locks, but instead of having that lock face, you use that same sort of ball mechanism to just give you that sort of detent sort of holding position. So when I started thinking about doing something in the non-locking design sort of realm, you know, I wanted to do something that was more than just this plain old friction sort of folder. And then realistically, the just lock bar or the basically leaf spring with the retaining ball detent really appealed to me as something that could be still in the same sort of knife construction realm, but made a little bit differently. And that's where I tried to take that and then do something a little bit different, is sort of reposition where those locking sort of features are, and then taking it forward of the pivot, then behind the pivot, and then making it sort of integrated into the handle, so that especially if you're holding it in a pinch grip sort of thing, your grip itself is sort of amping up sort of the detent strength. So it's actually very hard to disengage this when I got both fingers sort of holding onto it. Whereas when you put that behind a handle scale and something like that, you're only relying on just the the retention from the stiffness of that leaf arm sort of there and there. So definitely I would say it's a loose influence, but much more on the locking mechanism side of it than necessarily the overall design of it too. But that's why I also love working with Spyderco. They work with some of the better collaborators out there, and they've got a long history of innovation. So everything from the pocket clip to the opening hole, a lot of those are Sal's, inventions and things like that. The compression lock as well is one of my favorite locking mechanisms, and you see that in most of the designs that I've made as well too in previous collaborations. So it's kind of cool to work with a company that has that legacy and history, and then I enjoy incorporating those features because I just find those things like don't fix anything that isn't broken, right? The opening hole is by far, for a cutout sort of thing, the best opening mechanism. The knife clips are always cool to make it more pocket friendly and more utilitarian and accessible to people. So whenever you can sort of stand on the shoulders of giants, that's the right thing to do. So whenever I do consider a new design, I do go back and try and do at least a little bit of due diligence to see, is there anybody that I should be referencing? And Bob, in this case, for this type of double detent mechanism, is definitely at least the first place I've seen it. I don't know if there's some other sort of individual custom knife maker that might have done things as well. But Bob could probably answer that question better than I could as well. I would like to get more involved in that construction side of things. Maybe when I retire, it could be a cool sort of hobby to sort of kickstart and boot up. But no, I'm interested, but just having the bandwidth and the time to do it, I haven't really dedicated myself to it. And then, making that first sort of jump and buying a grinder or something like that so that I could do something like that. It could be possible. And to be honest, nowadays too, there's enough sort of real sort of stock removal processes out there where you can submit little jobs to small sort of owners because they're just trying to get, time on their machines to make it make sense for them. There's places like, what is it called? Like Exometry is one of the places I think of where you have like pretty much all the different sort of options available to you. But again, then you have to pay, to have that done. But with the relationship I have with Spyderco, I haven't really felt the itch to really get out there and do that sort of thing. But it might be something I'd be interested in the future. But to be honest, forging and stuff like that is a little bit outside of where I wanted to get. Like, that would be fun, but that's, getting the higher end blade steels and stock that's already about the right thickness, and then, you have it, EDM'd or water jet or something like that. That would be something I would entertain potentially, but I haven't really made any hardcore steps to make that a reality. If I was to create a lineup of the designers I really found the most influential and probably did a lot to sort of jumpstart me from the collector to the designer side of things, like a Mount Rushmore, so to speak. Yeah, I would say Ken Onion would be one of the first people I'd put on there. So, like I mentioned before, I've always been a knife collector. And then in between college and like maybe mid-30s, I'd say my knife purchasing sort of dwindled a little bit. And then when I started getting back into it, he was a name I recognized from I was young that was still doing really cool, fresh knife designs. And so he would be a maker I would say is one of my favorites. And then it was also cool to see him really aggressively take some of his custom knife designs and translate them to the production sort of market so I could afford them, sort of thing. And so that also got me a little bit more fan. Within the Spyderco sort of realm, I would say Bob Lum was an old collaborator, and I love sort of his Chinese folder sort of inspired designs too, and that's one of the models I have a ton of. And then also I put Sal on that sort of mountain as well. For a couple of his older designs, I would say, like the Spyderco Kiwi is one of my favorite sort of small gentleman's knives. I actually usually carry one with me, but I didn't bring one to the show now. And I didn't even know that was his because the originals aren't marked with his maker's mark. And when I talked to him for the first time at Blade Show, or not Blade Show, at SHOT Show a number of years ago, he let me know. He's like, yeah, that was his sort of design as well. And now the newer revisions and evolutions of those designs have his mark on it. And then the whole Calypso series. I love the ergonomics of that handle shape, and especially some of the early linerless versions of those. You get like a 4-inch blade on the original Calypso and like a very low weight sort of design. And I love the composite handles on that too. So I'd put him up there. There's a few more modern makers that I'm a loose fan of too, but I don't necessarily put them on sort of the level with those three that I would say. People in that realm, it's like there's a lot of other designers I love, but those folks, you know, not only have awesome designs, but contributed to the industry in a lot of cool ways. Like I mentioned, all the innovation that Sal has done. Ken Onion's the same way with like the speed safe sort of opening mechanism. And since I'm an engineer, I geek out a lot about those sorts of things as well. And then I appreciate, you know, Bob Lum's designs where he takes some of those traditional sort of patterns and then introduces them to the knife market. I guess if I had to put a fourth, it'd be one of the guys that's also here at the show. It'd probably be Ed Schimpf. So if a lot of the negative blade angle sort of designs that he's familiar with, where the handle has sort of an angle to it, and then the blade has that forward sort of cant, so you can use it for cutting tasks without having to rotate your wrist. He's probably the one I've cribbed more design language from in some of my earlier sort of pieces. And I just love interacting and talking with him and talking, you know, knife design. And also he's done some cool lock invention on his own as well. I'd put Ed Schimpf as the fourth one on that sort of page for me personally.